to realize that you screwed up late at night.
What you go to bed with is the wrong subject.
I had started painting 2 weeks ago. And it was a vertical painting. I had spent like 3 days getting 3 colors. It was like, it began like sort of a Joseph Albert, 3 squares. That was the stage setting for this calligraphic image that I wanted to come up with. So I got these colors absolutely perfect. And then it occurred to me to put in a circle there. So it became somewhat Japanese, but so what? Well, then it came time, to put the real meat into it. So I got all the paints out there, and unfortunately, acrylic dries rather quickly. So I had to keep putting new puzzles on it. And then I got the first 4 lines absolutely ravishingly perfect. I mean, I'm red here and like the. And then what? I knew I wasn't done. And then after about 4 hours, I put a little green in. Absolutely wrong. I mean, the minute I started it, I knew it was that. So the whole painting was ruined because so that's the 3rd or 4th worst thing that can happen.
I noticed Margie over there just laughing and smiling.
I knew when that acrylic came out. No, I thought that was
Can I go back?
You obviously haven't been talking to Joe Blower very long because he'll try every while that he has, he'll use on you.
Oh yeah, I've had about three little hints this morning already.
I'm so glad to meet you. I haven't been in this group when anybody would dare touch an acrylic. I've had to defend myself for quite a while. So I'm enjoying this because someone else is.
It's marvelous medium.
I used it for 10 years. What are you talking about?
I painted wood acrylic.
You used it for 10 years.
I used it up. I literally used it up.
That was before you saw the light.
What I liked was when Ray Ellis, when I said to him for about a week ago, 2 weeks, you are now working into oil, and he said, it's a luxury medium.
Oh,
he said, because you can move it all around, you can wait till it's all, you've got everything finished, and then you can put in some other things.
Yeah, but what do those of us do who are primarily draftsmen, and who aren't really painters? And even when I do calligraphic work, it's still basically drawing. It's still a linear expression. And so I got so sick and tired over these years, of resting my hand or having to put something over, the big little rod or whatever it is.
Right.
I never learned those terms.
Maul stick. In my case, it's a cane.
Oh,
That's better.
And the nice thing about acrylic is that you can rest your, heel of your hand right there, almost within 5 minutes or so.
Casein's even better.
Casein isn't like acrylic.
I didn't think they still had casein. I haven't seen it. I'm sorry, I believe because casein was what we used in school.
I'm a Neanderthal.
No, casein is what I learned, which was like the early version of acrylic, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And some milk base, isn't it? Milk base.
Yes, and of course it dries kind of matte and kind of cloudy, and it's not a very satisfactory all-purpose.
But there again, it's a wonderful medium for a draftsman. Perfect.
Well, if you're working all day on a drawing board, you want it to dry.
I rest my hand in the oil.
Wonderful effect will be. Oh, no, we know.
We get away with that theory now.
I don't see how you don't get sort of smeared up.
He does get smeared up. Oh, yeah. You from the acrylic. Can't scrape it out.
Yeah.
You can't what?
Scrape it out.
Oh, yeah.
Joe and I.
You peel it out.
It comes all off. It doesn't come partly off.
I remember one time in Cooper Studios, a painter we had there was Frank Mullins. He died, but he was a real gutsy painter, and he was painting a Sports Illustrated cover of some, I think it was a Nicholas, Jack Nicholas. And a bunch of us were in his studio, and he was finishing. He was really a very, very painterly kind of guy, lots of guts and everything. And he said, "Well, just a minute, I've got to do one more thing." And he took a swipe at Nicholas's head, and it came off. The whole thing just you know, and he took it, put a little polymer thing back on it, you know, like that, and kept, I mean, I would have, everybody watching died, and yet he just, you know, put it back on. That's when I said, God, there's got to be another way. I think that and Titian saying, the Titian saying that he was just, at the age of 90, he was just beginning to learn about the medium of oil. I said, uh-oh, I better start now.
Better start taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
But even with the things you can mix with it, it still isn't the same, because it's an artificial stimulant or whatever.
It's like gummy.
What gummy does that which
Acrylic.
yeah.
Yeah, it gets gummy and
Well, if you start using those extenders and all that kind of stuff. No, you want it because of its.
You like it.
You want that dryness so that you can go over and not pick up and stuff.
And you really can build up some nice effects too. I mean, you really can if you
I like
work.
the overlay.
Yeah, do some nice things.
What I get is this business of Marge is now knows that the value changes. When you mix a value and put it down, you know that as you turn away and you come back, that value is going to, was it lighten or darken? I can't remember.
In acrylics?
Darkens. So that you've got to know that what.
You gotta know how much.
You've got to know how much
You
that's.
mix it up.
And it's this, I guess after a while, if you're painting like Marge does, which is painting, which means pigment, not glazes, which I used to do a lot. It's very important to know just how much that thing's going to lighten or
You get into
darken.
a lot of trouble when you decide to redo the shadow side of the face
Mm-hmm.
in one spot.
Yeah.
So you're a portrait painter.
That's half the time.
Yeah. So that.
Yeah, I don't make it easier, they tell me. I know, I'm aware of that. I can't let go. It really, then,
No,
you know,
yeah.
I get a nice comment from Joe, he says, well, you know, your work would improve about 9% if you do oil.
We kind of give Marge a hard time.
It would smell better. I think there's nothing quite as nice as the smell of an oil painting.
Yeah.
It's just been painted.
I like that. I like the smell.
It's one of my earliest wonderful smells when I was a kid, which is smelling that in stores.
That always connotes artist, is the oil smell. It's like, to me, white's always, tennis player always, today, I hate all this color they wear. If you're going to play tennis, you have to wear white. There are certain truisms in life, and the smell of oil paint indicates artist. It goes way back. People come into the studio and go, oh, I love that smell.
May I quote you on this, Joe?
Yes.
As the saying of the day.
The last time I heard that was in the 60s, walking into a head shop.
Was that head as in tennis whites or head as in?
Yeah. When a customer comes, Joe, do you turn on the oil machine?
Oh, yeah. I sprinkle a lot of turps around to give it that.
Lois Dickens, she says allergic to that smell. She says she can't
allergic
stick
to it.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in my class that are. But they have that Grumtine now, which
There is
is
a new turpentine that you can use.
no smell.
Delicious.
I can take it in short doses, but like the other day in the printing press, by the end of the afternoon, I had
That's the medium that they use with the alkyds.
So there you go. It's a
The
chemical
alkyd
reaction.
paints.
Trying to use it with oil.
Yeah,
I know, it's
usable.
usable.
Paper and everything else.
Oh, you mean with the when you're doing the monochrome?
Relatively thin
I didn't even think about that. I knew you were allergic to
Enough to where you
it.
can't.
I don't, I ignore it, but when I'm away from
Pretty
it,
reliable people.
and I'm saying, why do I have this headache? And then
Based on their.
You know,
I
I
thought
all
you
I
painted
do.
in oils. You used it for
I
If it does what you want it to do.
You know,
This conversation
I think I can
reminds me of
rely.
something Picasso said.
Oh,
He
oh, I
said-
thought
someone
the
said,
product.
I suppose when a group of artists get together, they all talk about theories of
Right.
art. He said, when a group of artists get together, they talk about where you can get turpentine.
Plan it that way, instead of just
We've all been
correcting,
talking about it, it's fun.
balancing.
Ted, you mentioned something
That's
about
kind of
our
nice.
from Savannah the other day.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about it, and that was your relationship with the
So it all
Getting-
together,
Oh,
I have to
yeah.
depend on what to do.
No,
the
let's
Getty
see.
group.
They don't.
I thought that was fascinating because I had an opportunity to sort of touch base with the Getty group out in California when they were considering using their billions of dollars to set up an international, what would you call it, a center for collecting all of the art data throughout the world.
Yeah, the conservation. Yeah, it's conservation. Yeah, in fact, they've gone ahead with it.
Yeah.
They are going ahead with it. Yeah,
That was what they had decided they would use their money for.
It's one of the 4 areas that they're putting the money in.
What are you?
Well, there are 4. One is the museum, which is separate, and then there's art history. They are trying to consolidate, well, they're trying to create a kind of central area, a central clearinghouse for art historical information, and also conservation, very important. And then the 4th one is art education. They have picked up on something that's been running around in a rather undirected fashion for several years, and they're trying to use it in order to redirect American art education. And the idea being to, rather than focus almost exclusively on studio experience in teaching kids from kindergarten on up, that is that you work with watercolors, crayons, or whatever, and then occasionally you might go to a museum and so forth, is that as soon as possible, the school system should be able to integrate art history, art education, the studio experience, art criticism, aesthetics, and art history. In other words, all of the various disciplines, so that in the future, any kid in this country who is getting art education is going to become reasonably sophisticated by the time he or she is in high school, and familiar with what art history involves, what aesthetics involves, what art criticism entails. And so what the J. Paul Getty Foundation, or should say Trust, is doing, has done, about 3 years ago, they wrote to and they commissioned 4 position papers from 4 or 5 of the leading figures in American art education. And they have, I think by now they have finished the work itself. And for the last 2 years they have asked various people in the various aspects of the art world to meet and to read and to discuss what has already been written. And they have also sponsored seminars, various conferences, in essentially laboratory situations where these ideas are being tested. So I'm very much involved with that whole process of how to get art.
Where are you in that?
As an art critic, as one of the art critics, and since they have had 4 art critics involved with it. Mark Stevens, he I think is still with Newsweek, and myself, and a critic from the West Coast, and then a young woman who's working on a PhD in aesthetics and art criticism. And they haven't been able to get, from what I can tell, anyone else, because hardly any of the art critics are interested in art education. They see the 2 fields as being contradictory, conflicting, whereas I see them really as being part of the same process. And so that what I'm doing here is to attempt to figure out with them exactly how and what of art criticism is applicable to, say, kindergarten kids, first grade, second grade, and so on, and how we are going to introduce those concepts, and how we will, let's say, interrelate aesthetics and art criticism, which are very, very closely bound together, and how art history will come into it, so that it will be a, rather than 4 disjointed disciplines, it will be one harmonious whole that will be taught. And it should take another 20 years, I think, before they really are able to implement it, because there's tremendous resistance on the part of the education.
Do you work on a kind of grant basis, or how is your personal involvement in this?
My personal involvement is really, I get paid specifically for what I do, and a lot of it is really for nothing. That's the trouble with, because there have been all sorts of, see, that's a national project. And now, a good half of the states have regional or state projects similar to it. And they have hardly any money whatsoever. And the only money they get comes from the Getty. And so it ends up really by being volunteer work. And we get expenses, but that's about it. It really, so I have had to stop doing all of the smaller ones because I simply can't afford it for one thing. And well, as far as time is concerned too.
How does that coincide with the Carnegie Corporation's idea of that art education could best be done in the old apprenticeship method?
I really don't know. It would seem to conflict.
And they felt that that's why they introduced the artists in residence program.
Well, I think it's a very good idea.
And I think it was a good idea.
It's worked very, very well in Parliament, where you've had artists who have worked right in the school system,
and working
even
with
some of the great schools.
Then as each problem comes up, it's
however, the only problem there, I think, is that the quality of what you get depends on the quality of the artist there. And you aren't getting your overall perception, the student's overall perception, of the discipline or the field isn't going to be enhanced particularly.
No.
It becomes,
I know.
See, because I think that the Getty idea really is that the idea is not to make better painters and sculptors, but that since most of the people who take art are never going to paint or sculpt. So the idea is, what is there in the teaching of art or music or theater that has a socially and culturally, say, illuminating quality to it? And that's the focus, really, is to raise the level of civilization rather than to produce young artists. And I think that the apprentice system is more professionally oriented.
Yes, I think it is too.
Yeah, that's oriented to produce artists.
You're obviously going to be effective as well as
So there'll be a lot more than hanging around. Or else it'll be something everybody does. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
I think they do.
It's like making love. I mean, why should there be a few people, who make love when we all have the capacity to do it?
Well, I think that's great.
Here.
Everybody can
Some more capacity.
I expected a rousing cheer out of this
Speaking Bob's language.
I have a theory that everybody does paint. Everybody in the world paints and some won't admit it. That's my
Oh yes, my God! I mean, they are all over that. They really are like cockroaches, especially in New York. They are all over. Yes, I know. They are all over the place.
Wretched excess.
I mean, the whole city has got it. I mean, no matter where you go. Of course, in the East Village and so on and so on.
Well, in the midst of all of these painters and living in New York, where there are proliferating like cockroaches in New York. How are you going about your approach to getting a gallery and getting exposure?
Well, I won't have any trouble getting it.
He doesn't have to worry about it.
Jerry, I asked that question specifically, and I realized I'd asked a stupid question.
Yeah, no. I mean, I probably won't get the gallery I would like to have. I'm sure about that. But I've already had 4 galleries, four very good galleries who said that they would.
Could we ask which one?
No, I just assume not, because it might contaminate my reviews from now on. No, but also, I was walking with somebody at the Metropolitan. It was during the Caravaggio, it was a press preview, and I was talking to him, and we ran into Philip, who was the director of Philippe, and he was walking toward us, and the person I was with said, "Oh, by the way," I was just told that Ted is a painter again. And so I said, "Is there any chance of getting a show here at the Metropolitan?" He said, "Not even skipping a beat. How about 1993?" So, I suspect
what you're telling me is that the way to be an artist is to first be a successful critic and then you get 4 galleries.
No.
I don't think it works.
Sometimes it works. the kiss of death
It's
also.
also the kiss of death.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works both ways. As a matter of fact, I was on a plane with someone who is still an artist, but he's changed his name. He used to be with me, Brian O'Doherty. And we were
Oh, really?
We were going to Akron, Ohio to speak for some educational thing. And I said, I never met him before, and he was sitting in the plane, and I said, by the way, you reviewed one of my shows several years back. And he looked at me, and he said, well, how was it? And I said, well, it was fair, and he said, well, our position has changed now, because he now exhibits at Ireland, what's his first name? As Patrick Ireland. He's a conceptual artist, and just had a show out in Brooklyn. He's doing really very, very well. And so I said, yes, I'm just dying to get in. This whole question of getting a gallery is, I really don't know what to say, because it's so...
Well, what is the approach? What is the best, just to walk in and say, here I am, these are my slides, and this is what I do? Or do you have to go through, like...
First of all, there are many people who won't even pay any attention to you.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's the best way to do by the mail, send slides and...
Same thing there.
Same thing there.
I think the best way is to have somebody of some influence run interference for you.
That
I
believes in you.
Absolutely, yeah. No, see, I think that one of the first things I say to people who write to me from wherever is to come to New York, spend a week or 2 or 3, and just simply see which galleries you would like to be. I think that's very important too. And that first of all narrows.
Oh, I know which galleries. Well,
they want to ask which ones?
Well, to start with, Davis and Langdale. I love that little gallery, and I love what they have.
Yeah. Oh yes, you would like Kulicki's work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
that shouldn't be too difficult. That's a relatively easy gallery to get into, because they have a very, very clear-cut image. And that they do most of their work really is with 19th century and 20th century
yeah,
English.
See, I think I'm too loose.
You are. I'll tell you right now. I don't mean in the literal sense. I mean, if you were a woman.
Ted, I'd mentioned, I think probably the last time you were here, that our son works for Don Judd, and art critics generally hate Don Judd. Matter of fact, almost everybody hates Don Judd. He was an art critic before he was a quote unquote artist. And he is tremendously successful. He's riding the full crest of the resurgence of that period of art. And I'm very grateful for it, because it keeps my son working day and night and making a lot of money. But I met Don Judd maybe 30 or 40 times, and he's to put it kindly, he's kind of a miserable character. And he writes abysmally. And I don't know how he made it, except you put him in the context of the 60s art criticism and so forth. I can kind of understand it. But he's made the mistake of writing recently, and it's terribly ungrammatical.
And it's very dated.
Dated writing.
Well, because he was really an apologist as a writer. And I think that's always dangerous, because you will forgive in the same way that Jackson Pollock was forgiven many things, because he was revolutionary, and he was sort of hurling himself into new areas. And I think that when Judd was writing, he was viewed as a partisan critic rather than as an objective one. And I think his whole attitude is still the same way. As a matter of fact, he was on a panel recently with Carter Ratcliffe, and somebody mentioned that he had been a critic, and I think Carter said something to the effect, yes, not a very good one, or he made some very sarcastic remark. So I think that's a general.
He doesn't write coherently. And I wonder how he...
Maybe he's making his point obliquely. I mean...
Well, I suspect so, the same way he is with his art. But I shouldn't really knock this, because actually I've become well enough acquainted with it so that I kind of absorbed it and understand it to some degree. Sort of a backhanded way of getting at it. But the man personally writes terrible. But it was an entree into art somehow.
This is such an interesting conversation. I know there'll never be a good time to interrupt it and say, come have lunch. So it might as well be now since it's on there and it's hot.
Ted, I want to ask you,
Continue.
when we go in when we come back, that in lieu of in connection with John Judd, I have trouble with somebody who sits down, I know it's conceptual, and does a little sketch, that not very well, and hands it to his son, and his son builds an 85-foot sculpture that is then installed in Castelli.
Taking years to do.
Taking years to do, and that's all, and he doesn't even show up to supervise it.
Well, I have the same problem.
Is there a problem? I wonder.
I have the same problem, yes. I mean,
Okay.
I think I know the answer to it.
Do you?
I mean,
Does that
answer, which ultimately is that it is the concept and that it is the idea.
The idea that.
Yeah, and that he is attempting to cause the viewer to think or to approach certain issues in a new kind of way. In other words, here's this thing confronting you, and you have two choices. One is to walk away and say you're in, or the other is to try to understand it. And so the trick is to get someone to feel that there is something potentially in this. Now, a lot of the time, it is sort of the emperor's clothes kind of thing. But I think with Judd, there is something legitimate there.
But I think Joe's problem is with the fact that it's
the object.
Peter Valentine who builds it, not John
Well,
Judd.
that's because you're object related. I mean, if you work on art, it's an object.
My son puts himself in the same position. He's always given credit for these things, and he's embarrassed by it. He never goes to an opening, but he uses the expression, Don is the architect, I am the builder.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's an architect-builder relationship.
And
He said the builder doesn't take credit for a building, it's the architect who takes credit for it. And that's kind of the idea that...
John Judd trusts
Your
your
son,
son.
he understands that he will carry it through. He wouldn't just hand it to anybody.
Nice body.
And say, go do it.
Have substantive work. You're talking about where they are consistently.
In other words, I mean, you don't know the name, but they say, I have an interesting artist, and you feel like that gallery.
Yeah, but they call me up and they say that it's super.
I always like, I mean, when I go to New York, I like to know galleries.
John
to go
Weber,
to and
I would
see
pay
new
attention,
work.
although Weber tends to really prefer work of the 60s and
Weber?
70s. Yeah, John Weber.
And where is that?
He's on Green Street. He's right above Castelli.
Okay.
One of the Castellis. Speroni Westwater, who's in the same building. He had his Cookie, and I think he's one of the best painters in the world right now. Cookie and Clementi and some of the West German expressions. Castelli, not really anymore. I worked at for a while, except that he'd write there, so I would include him. I would say that too often when I go into either of his galleries, I am dealing with work that is primarily of the 60s and 70s. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the one gallery that's more exclusively focused into the 1980s. The Alan Crumpkin Gallery uptown, 57th Street. There actually are quite a few that I can just... Mary Boone I used to. I say the Pace Gallery, probably.
Paul Cooper?
Yeah, yes.
Four newest hotshot things.
Sobling Gallery.
Oh, I thought it was Boone.
No, that was not good.
Oh, okay.
You know,
Too many names.
that four, I can't think of all the
Did
names.
you say there was a relationship between Mary Boone and Castelli?
Would you get me a
from Leo Castelli to Mary Boone, and everyone thought that was a terrible thing, and he was a miserable guy and so forth. But it turned out to be very, very fortuitous for his career. It's
It
all of
worked
a sudden
well for
his
everyone.
career is again taken off.
Yeah, and so has Costelli's career taken off. But it was really right on the edge. Mary Boone really threatened Costelli. You know, if you're the top dog,
Thank you.
any genuine threat is not just to your livelihood, it's really to your identity as the top dog. I mean, you fall very far if you're the number one person. And Costelli was number one for 12, 15 years. And then along comes Mary Boone, and she very quickly threatened him on that position. And the next thing we knew that he and she had really joined forces. I mean, nobody really knows to what extent or how contractual it was or is. But they really...
I heard that it was a great thing for artists to move from Costelli to Mary Boone, and
Well, they have a lot of shows that are joined.
I know that.
It was a big step for Schnabel to move up to Pace, because it really cleaned up his act. It got rid of, the same thing, it would be like Reagan getting rid of all of the people who had messed things up there. Schnabel was really very contaminated I mean, his reputation was so confusing and so disturbing to many people, and the work itself was really, it was getting worse and worse, I thought. And then he went to Pace, and whether or not, there was talk that he was given $1 million to do it. I don't know if that's the case. I think he probably was shrewd enough to realize that he needed to go uptown. His next show was, I thought, a tremendous improvement. His first show at the Pace was, I really thought it very impressive.
But not as much as the new one. I mean, this new one is not.
Well, the new one is way below the
Right.
second one, I think.
The Kabuki,
Yeah. No, I think I think Schnabel has had his day.
Party's really over.
Yeah, I think it really is over for him. Yeah. Unless he really analyzes the whole. So he doesn't have the wit, or he doesn't have the overall detachment that someone like David Sally has. Sally can really see himself quite pragmatically, I think, and he can make career decisions very intellectually and very pragmatically. For Schnabel, I don't think ever has been able to. And so he plays it by ear, pretty much, and I think his ear isn't particularly good.
Did you see that?
Pardon?
Excuse me, did you see Nancy Graves' new show at the...
Yes, I did, yeah.
What did you think?
Very nice.
It's all on paper.
Yeah. Well, she's picking up again. I mean, she seems to go back and forth.
Yeah.
In this.
I've read about it, and I haven't... what is she doing on paper now? What sort of...
It's basically the same thing she did before, only it's broader. I mean, she isn't quite as abstract expressionist. She's a little more controlled in her shapes and so on. But it's the same kind of energy that she's putting into the
Have you
art.
seen anything that Rothenberg's doing?
I saw one large drawing at the Willard Gallery about 3 or 4 months ago, which looked the same as the other people. Well, I would also, I mean, there are other galleries. Holly Solomon interests me more and more because she has a few interesting people. There are, the thing say about someone like Alan Frumkin, whose artists range from being very, very tight and realistic to really wild and woolly, you know, like Chicago group. Every time I enter that building, and there must be 12 or 13, 15 galleries in that same building. The only one I'm interested really in
Which building is that now?
has 50 West 57th Street.
That's east?
West.
On the other side of the building.
Yeah, the Armstrong is in the same building.
Okay.
All these things. Yeah, and the reason for that is because I know that even if I don't like the show, I am going to be engaged in the work. And that, as much as anything, is what I'm looking for. Is something that is going to interest me, either intellectually or on a gut level, or something of that sort. And so I tend to go for those galleries that represent that kind of work.
Do you know the artist, Kiyomura? He's Japanese and he paints in Paris. I saw a show in Europe. I got the catalog.
Oh!
About a year ago, just wonderful. I never heard
And
of
Ruth
it.
Siegel.
Thank you.
Yes, right.
You're gonna get something
yes.
on it.
And I just thought it was wonderful. And I just haven't heard anything more
No.
about him or ever seen anything about him anytime.
No, I don't think the show was particularly successful.
Really?
He had been with the Findlay Galleries for a while, which is an interesting
Now, what do you think of his work?
Well, I liked it. I mean, I wasn't, there wasn't anything there that really particularly moved me. I mean, it was work that I responded favorably to it, but,
Lemon tart, that's a man's delight.
I remember you brought that brochure, Mary.
It's happened to the at one time, they had a great collection of middle of the century American art, Hirschman.
oh, yes.
And do they still function in this?
They have two galleries now. They have one that specializes in contemporary work,
Yeah.
recent American, and then they have the other one. Yes, they're still pretty much one of the 2 or 3 galleries that has the best selection of that kind of work. So that they still do a lot of that.
I used to think that Chicago had a wonderful collection of the galleries, and I think it's still maybe not the same. It's not only New York.
Oh, no.
I wouldn't even let you look at it.
Cisco, for example.
Would you like me if I look at it, I'll put it on the way.
You might find 1 or 2. That's about it.
I have good
But
news.
Chicago had large.
That's fine. Is that all?
Alan Frumpkin was there. Is he there now?
It was called Frumpkin dash something else at that point.
Oh.
But I think he's either sold that or it's gone under the
And
last year.
Fairweather Hardin used to
Yeah,
have a
they're still there.
How do you know?
Those are 2 lovely ladies, by the way.
Yes, are they still?
Yeah, they're still
And
very much there.
they had a collection of French Impressionists.
Oh, I don't know if they do that, but
They did that.
they're really.
Well, that's key lime pie, I'm pretty sure of that. And that is nuts and raisins and orange. And that's apricot,
You get things.
little apricot square.
Kelvin calls, come see this, come see that. How does a person like me down here find out what's going on where? What is a good source?
Well, I would say that little magazine called the Art Gallery, I think it's called, that you can pick up in most of the museums and most of the
That little
galleries.
gallery guide.
Yeah, little gallery guide. Yeah, I think that's probably as.
But that just tells you what's going on that month.
Oh, I see.
I mean, like.
In an overall sense, I don't think there's any place. I don't know of any place where you could get that.
I think that, you do better than most people to know what's going on all over the place,
You
and you
obviously-
go see it all. I don't know what you're trying to
You
find
report
out.
back.
You know it all, Mary.
Obviously, maybe that could be something that you could do, is to publish
She
something
goes
like that.
she knows
She'd be a
what's
great
going on in
scout.
Washington.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, there's lots of things I can do, but they all take up time. That's an occupation.
Yeah.
And I don't.
It is an
You want
occupation.
somebody else to
It's
do
an occupation just to keep up with what's going on in New York. And you can't keep up with what's going on in Zurich or in London or in Los Angeles at the same time. There's simply too much, because there are too many people out there who are too bright and too ambitious and who have very good PR people working for them, whose function in life is to come up with something new. I mean, that a lot of the art world is as fashion conscious and as novelty focused as Vogue magazine is.
Very much the same feeling.
Yeah.
Fashion.
Yeah, I mean, they work at this thing.
And the kids who are graduating today want to be successful. They're not going to be starving artists.
So you know anything about what's going on?
Oh, yeah, I get theirs. They have a new PR department. I mean, they've decided to
What's
go.
going on now there? Do you know?
They have a Jennifer Bartlett show. They originated the
Yeah, I
Jennifer
saw that
Bartlett
one.
show.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
saw that in Kansas.
they having an architects. They're having an architects show.
Did you get Kansas City?
She drove to Kansas City
Overnight.
to see that show. Can you believe it?
What?
Drove to Kansas City to see the show from here.
Yeah.
The Jennifer
Overnight,
Bartlett
that
show.
is.
No, she's not. She is unique and she's special. But I do know quite a few people who are like
Nuts
that.
like that?
Yeah, I mean, they're really, yeah.
No, I mean, you know what's, the reason I'm saying is I'm going out that way next
Ted.
month, and I was just
Oh.
curious.
Yeah,
I've
okay.
never been to the Walker, and I would like to go.
I don't know if the show will be up next month, but there is a very major, it's an architecture show. It's a retrospective of an architect. I don't know if it's Gary or who it is, but it's supposed to be a very major show. As I said, whether it's up next month, I don't know, but it's certainly up still.
In the Midwest, what
Ted.
are some other very interesting museums? Is, you know, just trying to play my.
Almost all of them.
You take pretty sure.
No thanks.
Ted, how many people do you know who drive, like Mary does?
Oh, about 2 or 3.
2 or 3?
Yeah.
I bet they don't read novels.
No, no. While they're driving?
Oh, she doesn't take the
Oh my God. I mean, she has it.
She doesn't put them on tape, she reads it.
As long as she's not painting, you know, while.
You could paint the landscape. Paint the mountains.
Take the landscape and you go back.
Ted, I want to,
I don't think.
we have this group has a discussion every once in a while about great artists, who our favorite artists are in the history of the world. We even could give ourselves a thing where we bring in examples of each of our favorite portraits, each of our favorite landscapes.
One of our problems was that Mary, I think, proposed this, was if you could own 10 paintings, was that it?
Yeah, in that, like, if you could own 10 paintings in the world, which would they be, and you'd have to come in and explain it. And you've written a couple of things on the word great, and how, we talked about it this morning, how you don't use that very sparingly, the word. What, and you said there are only maybe 15, and the last great one was Cézanne.
That I'm certain of.
And, what?
That he's certain of.
Yes, that I am certain of.
Yeah, that's all. And that there are a few others. We're always saying, I wonder what Ted's, you're always thinking of talking about lists or something, but you never come down and.
I remember in Savannah, I asked you your.
Come down here.
You like this artist.
The top of it, and I remember
I'll wait.
Whom did I
I'm
say?
curious
Here we
what
are.
you think now, whether it's the same.
Whom did I say?
I'm not gonna tell you how they do.
That's a dirty, mean, it's
Yeah, she is.
mean.
Don't look.
Oh, that was 2 years ago.
Don't look.
Oh, yeah.
Now that,
They're both American, right?
now that you're painting.
This is yours now.
Yeah, I'm different now. I'm a different person.
2 years ago.
Is this any American or a living American?
Any American. You had two, one for the living and one for just any American, who you thought was, you know, maybe not the greatest, but I mean, you know, just really should be up there.
Oh my God.
You know, it reminds me of the head of the Wellesley Art Department was giving a lecture. She said, Greek art is the most beautiful art, the greatest art in the world. And some little voice in the back of the room said, but yesterday you said it was medieval art. She stopped.
Thank you.
She said, that was yesterday.
Well, I'm trying not to remember back how I felt, 3 years ago. And let's assume. Gee, I must have changed my mind because I can't really think of any this particular moment. I'll give you a cluster.
American or?
Okay, well now, who do you think is the one of the top living American artists?
Oh,
That's a toughie.
oh, I would definitely say Andrew Wyatt. Definitely, absolutely. Oh, I will stake my life that 100 years from now, the 3 artists of this period who will be remembered are Jackson Pollock, Alexander Calder, and Andrew Wyatt. The 3 Americans. Because they're the only ones who really have created not only a style and an approach, but they've also created an entire world. I mean, they are that you know exactly what you're saying when you say a Pollock or a Wyatt, or a Calder, in the same way that you know what you mean when you say a Cézanne or so forth. And I don't think there's anyone else that we have who has created that crisp a noun.
That's interesting.
And I would think Calder and Pollock especially have made a great impact on Europe. as
Yes,
representing American art. Not Wyeth so much, but...
No, because in fact Wyeth is ridiculed. I mean,
Yes.
the English
Yeah.
see him as sort of a latter-day pre-Raphaelite.
But
On the other hand,
Pollock and
And
he
Kohler.
made an influence, a
Yeah.
big impact on the Japanese and
Yeah.
on the French, and Kohler on the French particularly.
yeah, well, Oldenburg has made a great impact too. But Oldenburg, I don't think is in
No,
that
he's
category.
not in that class.
No. I mean, he just isn't. Well, interestingly enough, I had lunch about 4 or 5 years ago. It may have been before I was here with Kosygin or Kostakin, the man who revived Russian constructivism. He was in Russia and he started buying up Russian constructivist work. And he managed to get it out of Russia. He made a deal with the Soviets. And he had a huge exhibition at the Guggenheim about four years ago. Anyway, he is probably the world's expert on Russian constructivism. That's his life. At the end of our lunch, I asked him, who do you think is the most important and the best American artist of the last 50 years? And without batting an eyelash, he said Andrew Wyeth, for much the same reason that I've just given. Then the State Department had an exchange program. They have a pretty good thing where they invite the art critics from various countries to spend 6 or 7 weeks in the country traveling around. And so one of the last things that this man from Brazil wanted was to spend an afternoon with an American art critic. And since I'm an international paper, which the Monitor is, we spent about 2 hours together. And I asked him at the end of the afternoon who he thought the two most important 20th century American artists were. And he said Kohler and Wyeth. Once again, without any question. And I said, how about Jackson Pollock? And he said, well, yes, maybe, but he said he's not as important. Those were the artists who really struck him. That when he came here, he looked at everything we had, and those are the artists that made the strongest impact on him. And I think there's a reality to that. I still think also that at his best, Norman Rockwell is going to be remembered in a way that
I'm so glad to hear you say that.
I think that if you take the 20 best paintings done in the last 50 years in this country, you have to have at least one Norman Rockwell.
When you wrote that article, and I have it in my little thing on Norman Rockwell, it was almost like, if I could write, that's exactly what I would have written. And you said almost in what I say, there are like 6 or 7 Rockwells that belong. And I said that about almost the same amount that I could pick them out. They might not be the same, but I'll bet you they're the same.
I bet they are.
That are absolutely
in the 50s, I think, is when he did
53s. 53 and 4 were his absolute top. And they were covers. So it was post covers. They transcended the illustration. They were works of art. I mean, in the best sense of the word.
Oh, I really do. I mean, I think that...
Why is it that critics in general, art critic, quote, do not give any time to a man like Rockwell or Wyeth? They put them almost in the same mere illustrators. That whenever I read that, the fact that mere is always...
I never use that word anymore.
I noticed that. But I mean, it's like illustration is not a word. It's got to have mere in front of it if you're writing a lot of art.
I don't know.
It's almost like
Rockwell is a hopeless case.
Rockwell,
you can't do anything about it.
He always said he was an illustrator.
Yes. But
sure.
Wyeth is one thing that you were one of the few critics, if not the only one I've ever known that is devoted to art. And I really, in fact, I was so entranced with it that one major one that you wrote on, I called Frank Fowler, who was his agent, when I read the thing to him, I said, listen to this. I was so impressed with it. Well, Frank wasn't quite as elevating as he would like it to be, but I thought it was a very fair article. And but you don't get it from anybody else. It's just like it's like the plague. You don't even mention the word.
No, because they don't. They simply won't look. I mean, I mention Wyeth, and they don't know how to look. First of all, I mean, they haven't got the context within which they can appreciate Wyeth, because any context for them immediately is the belle of illustration or 19th century genre painting. Right. One of the two things, and those things are either dead and gone or whatever. And I have a theory also, and well, I'll get into that later. But But quite often, I mean, this has really become a cause célèbre for me, is the Andrew Wyeth thing. And it is almost a hopeless situation too, but I think there is still some hope that something can be done in the next 5 or 6 years. They don't look, because among other things, they don't have the frame of reference within which they can really comprehend it. I think also it has to do because the American art community is anxiety dominated, and even though Wyeth has a touch of melancholy and anxiety, there is implicit in his work a sense of perfection, a sense of wholeness, and a sense of healthiness, even though it happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago. There's a melancholy recollection of a more perfect time. And I think that this is embarrassing for the American art community. Same reason why, for instance, someone like Kate Kowitz, who I think is one of the greats of the century, is really downplayed these days. I went into a gallery, it's a new print dealer, and marvelous show. And I said, "You have no Kowitzes?" He says, "Well," I said, "No, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I think so." He never could really articulate what he said. It's just that he was reflecting the general feeling, which I think, among other things, Kowitz is one of the few artists of the century who was really able to articulate love. And in its painful as well as its possible side. And this is embarrassing. Now, Wyeth does too. You know, the fairly recent painting of Wyeth.
Sentimentality or what? What is it?
I don't know. You know, that the critical community right now wants art to be disjointed, alienated. And I think that even though Wyeth, see, this is why I think that Wyeth, there's hope for him, because there's that melancholy. Rockwell not, because Rockwell, even at his best, still speaks of this as the best of all possible worlds. You know, I mean, there's that romantic notion about how wonderful life is. And with Wyeth, there's not. So there is a potential there, I think. But primarily, I think it's people, they don't think of him, and they have cliche responses.
See, Andrew Wyeth doesn't need critical acclaim these days to be successful. I mean, he obviously is doing very well. And I would think that critics, by and large, are writing about what's trying to find that that edge, what cutting edge, whatever is out there, talking about that more than reflecting on the breadth of what's there and what's happening today. Somebody later on will look back and see that Andrew Wyeth's work is a certain body and has a point of view, and it will last. People didn't write about Bonnard particularly favorably at the time.
A good parallel is Thomas Eakins, because Eakins really had the same kind of problem. He wasn't as successful as Wyeth. But I do think that I mean, I agree with you on that, but I think that being a critic is not only, being a critic, even if you're a painting critic or a theater critic or whatever, you are a culture. You're a culture critic, and that means that you should be interested, it seems to me, unless you are merely a journalist pointing out what's new. It should really do with what is of significance to my readers. What in the area that I'm writing about, which happen to be painting, sculpture, and printmaking and drawing, what there is of interest to my readers. Now, the primary focus should be, I think, on what's happening, wherever it's happening. But Wyeth is also happening at the same time. So I think that is a peripheral kind of interest. The critic should be involved in this issue of whether or not Wyeth is saying something. Why is he so popular, but so loathed by the critics? That's a very important subject.
I was going to ask you, why is it that critics seem to be have anxieties about writing about Wyeth?
They
never come.
Well, as a matter of fact, you know, Henry Geldzahler quit the Metropolitan. His leaving was precipitated by the conflict with Holding on the Wyeth show.
Really?
He refused to have anything to do with it, so Holding took over. As a matter of fact, in the middle of the Helga controversy, I had a call from the BBC, and they wanted to do a half-hour program on the Wyeth issue. And I said, "You mean the Helga issue?" And she laughed and she said, yes, well, that's really it. So I said, why did you ever call me? And he said, well, we called Coker and we called the Wyatt family, and there were only 2 writers or critics whom they could think of who would be objective, let alone sympathetic. One was Thomas Holding, and the other one was myself. That everyone else would be apt to be negative.
That's interesting. And in support of what you said about Calder and Pollock, I think I can say I've never seen a small city in France without its Calder.
Oh, really?
And they have a Calder
Pardon, in France?
in France, and they'll have a Calder at the railroad station and a Calder maybe in a little plaza in front of the university. And there was a delightful person, an old lady, you might have said in those days before I didn't use that term anymore. There was this delightful woman who helped a number of young artists in France. She supported them, really, with her fortune. And when we were talking to her about American art, she said, Jackson Pollock.
Oh.
And she was a real enthusiast of Jackson Pollock. And there are many who I think join her in this as a typical American.
Well, the thing is, he even when over the last couple of days, I'd say 5 or 6 people in talking about art have used the term abstract expression. They mean Jackson Pollock. In other words, Jackson Pollock, that's what they have to deal with. Like the young man that I met over at the gallery this morning.
West Fraser.
Yeah, I mean, he spoke of the abstract expressionists almost as the enemy. I mean, almost as though...
You can understand it.
Oh, no, I do understand. I mean, I don't know his work, but I do understand. Yeah, I do understand. I really do. Because you literally, it's the same way. I think that psychology, I mean, I'm not making Pollock more important than he is, but still, in a certain way, historically, you can't get around him. He's an obstacle. He became an obstacle to a certain kind of unfoldment of art history, and that you really have to take him into account. Even now, 40 years, 30 years after he died, he is there. I mean, as this young man, I mean, he's still, when he's talking about his decision about his career, I mean, Pollock is still there, and I suspect Pollock is going to be there for a long time. Yeah, or whatever. I mean, the same way when I was younger, it was Picasso. I mean, you just simply didn't get around that basket. I mean, and then I think Pollock did take over. He's nowhere as important or as good as Picasso, but Pollock, for Western painting, I think to a large extent, Pollock did. He just simply, he pulled the rug out from under something, and you either had to say, put the rug back again, I think it's important, but you had to be able to do it with a certain authority, because Pollock did match a need, and there was a certain inevitability about what he did. And there it is. I mean, you just can't, in a way, he might be a Hitler, like Hitler. I mean, but you can't ignore certain things. And
Do you think Cézanne did the same thing in his
Oh, yeah. Well, Cézanne really, I think, I mean, that we're still trying to deal with Cézanne. But I think the big thing about Cézanne is that he's the last artist who really had everything in one bundle. He's the last one really to have the package, or to have the laundry basket full. Every artist since then has made mountains out of molehills, relatively speaking. And that's why I would question, there is still a little doubt in my mind as to whether or not Picasso is a genuinely great artist. Because the one thing he lacks, perhaps because he couldn't do anything else. I mean, after all, being of the 20th century, you have to be of your century. It may have been impossible for him, but greatness for me does really mean getting everything together.
What did he lack? You started to say what Picasso lacked.
Picasso is, and here's where the lack comes in. In other words, see, I think Picasso was caught in an art historical situation where all sorts of dead wood had to be, all sorts of dead trees. I'm speaking metaphorically here. Something I brought up this morning. It's how we read what happened between the 19th and the 20th century. It depends on several things. We can either see the 19th century as a beautiful forest, which was chopped down in the 20th century, and that what we have in this century is just a bunch of garbage lying around. Or we can see what happened as the chopping down of a forest in order to plant an even better forest later on. And so the issue is the 20th century a wasteland, or is it a new area that is being plowed under and that is being planted with something new? And I know that this is very